Well, good afternoon, Eric. Here we are in St. Paul in December 2016, and it's pretty cold out there today. I think it was like -5 when I went to my first meeting. -5 Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
But we're in an interesting position, I think, in America, but it may also reflect some of the discontent in Europe as well. We recently had the rejection by Italian voters of constitutional reform proposals in Italy. Francois Hollande, the president of France, pulled out of the re-election campaign. Marine Le Pen, who represents a kind of populist, nativist point of view in France, is in the running. Her support is significant. Here we're several weeks after our presidential election, which was back on November 8th, and one senses that the divisions between Donald Trump and his supporters and the Hillary Clinton and the Democrats and the liberals, the divisions they're not healing. They're maybe even deepening, getting harder, as President Trump puts together a cabinet of some very, one might say, opinionated people. One might also say that they have very strong views and more populist views. We had an interesting election. In that to some extent it was a contest between a sort of status quo, more of the same, and then a rejection of the status quo by people from lower classes, middle class, lower middle class, younger people, millennials, who have been experiencing economic difficulty for a long time now. The Trump supporters more experiencing flat wages, loss of jobs, declining conditions in housing and growth in their communities. I think the Bernie Sanders supporters, who are younger, a lot of the millennials are worried about the future. They don't see where their jobs are going to come from. They don't see where the income is going to come from. And they were really in a mode of fear, of anger, of protest, of saying we want very different kinds of outcomes in America, from government and from business. And they carried their resentments and their feelings and their fears into the election. On the Trump side, they were able to come up with a presidential candidate. On the Sanders side, they got very close, but in the last analysis, the last moment, Hillary Clinton and the establishment of the Democratic Party prevailed. So you had an establishment candidate with the Democrats, a disturbing kind of candidate, an upsetting kind of candidate, a populist kind of candidate for the Republicans, and the Republican leadership of the status quo had melted away. There were 16 candidates, something like that, and Trump knocked them all off. However, there are differences between the more rebellious forces, the forces seeking change. And rather than working together, they don't cooperate. They don't trust each other, which is interesting because that's been true for a while. We've had some experience here in Minnesota that there are predecessors to both the Trump voting bloc and the Sanders voting bloc. These voting blocs, these points of view, these feelings, these desires have not come out of nowhere. They're not new. On the Bernie Sanders side, it goes back to the Occupy Wall Street movement of 2011. Here in Minnesota, we had Occupy Minnesota, taking on the financial industry, the banks, the wealthy people. On the Trump side, back in those days, we had what was called the Tea Party. And the Tea Party were people mostly middle class, lower middle class, more rural, small town. They were not wealthy people at all, and they were angry, and they were fearful. And they did not like President Obama's policies. They did not like Obamacare. They did not like the federal government. They somehow wanted to just tear the system down and somehow do better things for ordinary people. We pulled together a couple of roundtables here in Minnesota, inviting both the Occupy Minnesota and the Tea Party leaders to come together for a roundtable to talk about the future of America, what's wrong and how to fix it. And we observed one thing, that they tended to ignore the commonalities and focus on what they differed over. The commonalities you could see where they were both had the same analysis of what was going wrong with the power structure and with the economy. Too much power in too few people. Wealthy people who then dominated the political system. Not enough wealth going to the middle class and the lower classes, who were frozen out of the leadership. The leadership, the elites, they were saying, take care of themselves. Cronyism in Washington. And the Tea Party Republican people saw that the Republican establishment, they criticized the Republican establishment for being part of this crony elite. But rather than sort of shake hands and say to the other side, the Tea Party versus Occupy Minnesota, we agree with the diagnosis. We agree that America is top-heavy towards too few people. Let's work together to see what we can do with market institutions, with financial institutions, and with government to sort of tilt the balance back towards a middle class. But they didn't do that. The Occupy Minnesota people, as the Bernie Sanders people, it seems, have an implicit faith in government, and that government can solve the problem one way or another, through higher taxation, through entitlement programs, through regulation, whatever. But opposed to the Bernie Sanders approach, the Trump approach, going back to the Tea Party people, they don't like government. They don't trust government. They think government is a failure. And that's very core in their personalities, in their emotions, in their fears. So that when one side would start to propose a solution, the other side would drop the sense of common cause and immediately move to criticizing the solution. So if the Sanders people would come up with some program for the government to do something, the Tea Party people would sort of get their backs up pretty quickly and start criticizing that approach, that solution, and then going on to criticize the goodwill and the motivation of the people who were proposing it. And then they would say, on the Tea Party, or now the Trump side, they propose something like a more private market or private enterprise or something like that, at which point the Occupy Minnesota and now the Sanders people would criticize that solution and then begin to question and sometimes denigrate the goodwill, the motivation of those proposers. So this is a situation where we seem to again have gridlock, gridlock on very different points of view about government, about markets, which flows over to the way we treat and think about other people. This undermines the quality of discourse in politics, which is a co-roundtable principle. It also undermines the possibility of trusting people who have different ideas than you. And it's hard to see how a good democracy can thrive when there are very low levels of trust.